Hello, everyone. This is State Representative Kate Lipper-Garabedian. Thank you for joining me for a bittersweet Conversations with Kate. Today, I'm going to be talking with Julia Germani, my legislative aide, who's been behind the scenes on every one of the podcasts since she joined the office in November of 2021. So basically a year and a half plus ago now. And you're transitioning off at the end of July for great things to come. So, Julia, it's great to have you back. We did this really at the beginning of your time with the office, and here we are at the end of it.
Yes, I'm glad to be back. Thank you for having me.
I'm very happy to have you. So let's talk a little bit more now that you've been in the role for a year and a half about what it takes to be legislative aide. What is that like in the State House?
Sure. So I started, as you said, in November 2021, so pretty much still in the height of the pandemic. So I transitioned on completely virtually. For listeners who don't know, I'm the rep's sole staffer, which I often compare to the composition of a Senate office where you might have a chief of staff, an LD, legislative director, communications director, constituent services director, district director, etc.
Yes.
So in that space, everyone's roles are very well defined, whereas as a legislative aide, your professional responsibilities are less well defined and just far-reaching. So it was definitely a very interesting experience. I was also very grateful when I started, you had a 9-month fellow on.
Yes.
And she was able to train me. So that was helpful.
Yes, and you were listing out all the things that maybe a senator has, within the staff, and you're sort of doing all of those things, right? Mm-hmm. So you are helping out with the legislative portfolio in terms of helping file bills and track them and prepare for committee hearings. You're doing communications work with press releases, social media.
Right.
Constituent services is a huge part of your job.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, don't quote me on the number, but upwards of 40 bills you had filed.
Right.
So there's also a broad range of topics and within that one area.
That's true. Right. And so learning about those and then keeping an eye out for events that we need to attend that are related to them, or preparing for our own events and managing those. So it's a lot. So in the space of all of that work, any most fulfilling moments or memorable things that have happened over the last year and a half?
That's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind is probably just assisting with all of the constituent cases. There are probably too many to name, so I won't go into those, but it can be incredibly rewarding to see, the power of government for good and helping with people's lives. But legislatively, two things that come to mind are two bills that you file, the first of which is the Location Shield Act.
Yes.
Which would prohibit the sale of an individual's location data. And that was really special to me because the concept of privacy was really the first issue I was interested in public policy, dating back to high school when I wrote an essay on the unconstitutionality of locker searches, which I think is a little bit of a stretch, but the sentiment still remains. And I wrote my law school personal statement on it, the concept of the right to privacy in the digital age.
Right.
And when I was a freshman in college, I wrote a policy memo basically advocating for a bill to be filed at the federal level, which we haven't seen yet, but it was meaningful to work for a state legislator who ended up implementing that. And we worked in partnership with the ACLU of Massachusetts, who I believe will be a guest on Conversations with Kate in the future.
Right.
But I had done an informational interview that same year in 2018 with the lead of the Technology for Liberty program, who was very involved with this bill. And then 5 years later, almost to the day, we had a strategy meeting about testifying in support of this bill. So very full circle.
Right. And you will stay in touch, I know, even after your time in the office ends, in terms of just being aware of this bill. And even I'm sure I'll get texts from you sometimes about a strategy idea that you have for it. So I'm really glad to have gotten to work on it with you.
Yes. And then secondly, I touched on this a little bit in my first podcast episode, is the concept of deception in police interrogations, which is a personal interest of mine dating back to college. Again, I wrote my senior thesis on it, and then I was really grateful for you supporting me in investigating that further in my role. And Rep. Kate this session actually filed a bill that would prohibit the use of deceptive interrogation methods in both juvenile and adult interviews, and mandate the recording of all custodial interviews. So it was good to be able to learn more about that and work with the New England Innocence Project to draft the legislation and file it. So I'm really grateful for that as well.
That's great. And I'm really excited to have been able to file both of those bills, including with your support and insight and leadership on them. So when we think about, state government, I remember, you were reminding me of our first interview or podcast where we talked about that you'd had a lot of exposure maybe at federal level in terms of how bills work their way through the process and how important congressional action is on things that matter nationally. But now you've had a front row seat in state government, in a state house, including both virtually and now we're fully back in person. And anything that, sort of stands out to you about what it's been like to have that level of exposure?
Sure. So as I mentioned in my first podcast episode, in college, I was a political science major, so I took a lot of classes relating to the legislative process, but almost all of them were touching on the federal process, which, as you mentioned, is really important, and in a lot of ways, moving legislation through the federal process is ideal so that everyone has the same protections. But right now, we're seeing a lot of rights being stripped back. And so in the absence of federal action, it's really important that state legislators step up and protect residents and protect citizens, especially during, the pandemic. I know we supported a lot of constituents during the pandemic with unemployment issues, housing. I feel like in constituent services and state government, it's not necessarily the most glamorous issues, but truly, truly so critical.
Right.
And makes a difference in people's life trajectories, really. And then also we saw the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. There was, a gun decision that struck down a law in New York that then impacted our state's gun laws.
Right.
Just yesterday, the court struck down affirmative action. So really, I don't think that there has been a more important time in recent history for the role of state legislatures. So it's been very rewarding to be able to get a front row seat at that.
Right. And you'll be able to take that perspective into your next pursuits, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yes.
But before we get to that, I'm wondering, one thing that really commended you to the position of legislative aide for me when I was seeking someone was the fact that you went to Northeastern. You had done a number of co-ops, including some in fields that were really relevant for state government. But this was your first full-time job. I mean, we both knew you were interested in law school. But I'm wondering, given that you're coming to the end of your first full-time job, what advice would you give for young professionals, including, for example, our summer interns and others who may be thinking about what their first step after high school or after college will be?
Sure. Well, everyone is in a different circumstance, but generally, and this isn't really novel advice, but it's something that I was pretty reluctant to accept when I was in college, is to take time off before you go to graduate school. I've always known I wanted to be a lawyer, and when people said that to me, I was like, well, I know I want to be a lawyer, so why is it important for me to take time off? Like, I don't need to consider this further.
Right.
And for reasons related to the pandemic, it sort of became an involuntary decision that I was going to take time off. And I'm so, so grateful that I did. I think it's important just to be able to learn how to work a 9 to 5. I learned so much about the legislative process, and as I said, I took classes on the legislative process, but you really don't know what the legislative process is like until you've worked in the legislature or adjacent to the legislature, like just especially within a certain state, like certain terminology, like what does it mean for a bill to go to study? What does it mean if a bill is in the committee on third reading? Like, it's very different for each state.
Right.
I mean, it still has the same underpinnings, but
right.
Now that I am going to be staying in Massachusetts, I think that it was really helpful for me to work here. Additionally, when I came in, I mentioned this to you earlier, and earlier in this podcast, I had my own professional interest that I was able to weave into supporting you and supporting the residents of the 32nd Middlesex District. But obviously, you have your own professional interests, and I work for you. So Rep. Kate's background, as you probably heard on this podcast before, is in education. I knew literally nothing about education before coming into this role. So I learned a lot about that. Rep. Kate is really involved with blockchain. I knew not even how to define the word blockchain prior to this role. And I think it's really easy to silo yourself to one, or two policy areas that you're really passionate about. But for me, it was really helpful to be able to learn more about all of these things. So my advice would be, A, take time off, and B, do not silo yourself. Be really open-minded about really just absorbing everything and learning.
That's great. And, for a moment of personal privilege, I also did not go straight from undergraduate to law school. And I think it really helped not only for the enriching experience I had in between professionally, but also I think it made me more successful as a student in law school because I really treated it like a job as opposed to like an extension of undergraduate studies. And that served me well, and I think it's going to serve you well too. So let's talk about that. Tell everyone what your next steps are, what's happening on that, and what do you sort of envision for the next chunk of your professional career?
Sure. So I'll be transitioning off as Rep. Kate's aide on July 21st, and then I'm starting at Boston College Law School at the end of August, which I'm super excited about. Always known I wanted to go to law school. As I mentioned earlier, I wrote my personal statement on the right to privacy in the digital age, so that's a passion of mine. So that'll be 3 years. I'll likely have a number of internships during those years. Probably right after I graduated, like to work in a firm. I'm not exactly sure which practice area, maybe data privacy, but also given this experience, I know a lot of firms have state government practice areas, so potentially I could be an asset given my experience here.
Right.
In the wake of Roe being overturned, a lot of firms, or a number of firms, including Foley Hoag, where I did my first co-op, stood up a reproductive justice litigation unit. So that's also really interesting to me. So we'll see. Ultimately, professionally, long-term, I want to work in public service in some capacity, but that's still TBD.
Well, and that's fine as well. It should be, including because taking your own advice when you get to law school, you want to be open to other practice areas or that, may really speak to you as you learn more about them.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. So in closing, we've talked a lot about what's been going on at the State House and also all the support that you've done for constituents here in the district. And it's really true and such an asset to me and to everyone who lives here to know that you are someone who they could have turned to for questions or just guiding through a process, and really grateful for that. And you've also, over the course of the 18 months, been able to come up to the district quite a number of times, including for these podcast recordings. So why don't you share out some of your favorite 32nd Middlesex district spots that you'll think fondly of and hope they come back and visit?
Yes. Let's see. I love to eat. And oftentimes when I come up, we get lunch. So I'm going to touch on a few restaurants. The first one that comes to mind is Jitters. They have phenomenal sandwiches. Would recommend.
Yep.
Mexico Lindo has amazing queso.
As my boys would tell everybody.
Yes. So I'm going to have to take a field trip back.
Okay.
MMTV, where we are right now, is really meaningful to me. I've probably been here 20 times or up, including
that's
for
true.
podcast recordings or office hours. It's a wonderful space, and it has wonderful staff. And I was a little emotional coming up this morning thinking that it was going to be, or knowing that it's going to be my last time here, at least for a while.
Right.
But yeah, and then we also held office hours one time over at Lake Q, and that was just very scenic and beautiful. So a lot of hidden spots in the 32nd Middlesex.
Great. Well, Julia, thank you so much for joining me for this podcast, and particularly for all of the service and leadership and support that you've provided over 18 plus months as my legislative aide, my sole staff person. It's been a pleasure working with you. I'm really excited for what comes next, and I know that you'll continue to do wonderful things. Everybody, thanks for listening to this Conversations with Kate's podcast with Julia Germani, my legislative aide, for a few more weeks. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.